Has this ever happened to you? You're in a theater watching the latest IP and you find yourself laughing at a clever turn of phrase, a pun, or an absurd situation? Well, that's what's known in the business as a joke. And these days, most movies will have anywhere from 2 to 4 of them. Well, what if I told you there was once a time, not so long ago, when movies had dozens, often hundreds of these jokes. These movies were called comedies. And there would often be a new one in theaters every couple of weeks, and they were incredibly popular and profitable. There were no space battles or gunfights or train crashes. I know, it's wild, right? But wait, it gets even wilder. You see, these days we express our shared cultural knowledge through memes. But there was a time when you proclaimed your pop culture bona fides by yelling, usually context-free, phrases like, "You're my boy blue," and "If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball," and "She was a hoe." Faux show. Now odds are, if you're a man over 35, those phrases just activated you like a Manchurian Candidate sleeper agent. And kids, if you're watching this with your dad and his eyes just glazed over, don't worry about it. He's just flashing back to every beer pong tournament he was in from 2004 to 2008. So gather round, children, as I share with you the story of the last great age of comedy. And the kings of this age were known as the Frat Pack. The Frat Pack was a play on the Brat Pack, which was itself a play on the Rat Pack. The Frat Pack existed from approximately 2001 until 2014, give or take. And at its core, the Frat Pack was an informal group of comedic actors, writers, and directors, almost entirely men, almost entirely white. You had Will Ferrell, Ben Stiller, Jonah Hill, Vince Vaughn, Steve Carell, Paul Rudd, Sacha Baron Cohen, Jack Black, Danny McBride, Jason Segel, Owen Wilson, James Franco, Seth Rogen, Jay Baruchel, John C. Reilly, David Koechner, Luke Wilson, Bill Hader, Martin Starr, and Craig Robinson, along with others. Behind the cameras were the directors, producers, and writers. These guys were the seeds from which huge, overlapping family trees sprouted within the pack. The most important of these people were Todd Phillips, Judd Apatow, and previously mentioned Ben Stiller. But what defines a Frat Pack movie? The criteria are as follows. It needs to have been released between 2001 and 2014. It must star at least 2 of the dudes mentioned above, and ideally have several more of them in supporting or cameo roles. It can only be a comedy, or at least a comedy hyphen, for example, action comedy. And it needs to be at least PG-13, special points if it's R. The plot doesn't really matter that much, but it does help if it's vaguely about 2 or more men in their 20s or 30s who need to learn to grow up and accept responsibility in some capacity. They need to become adults. Oh, and they're almost always middle to upper middle class. Okay, so those are the broad parameters. There can be variation here and there, but they need to meet at least most of what I listed above. Everyone got that? All right, let's take a trip down memory lane. Let's get a brief history of some of the key players, starting with Ben Stiller. Stiller was the son of comedy legends Jerry Stiller and Ann Mira, and he'd been acting since the 80s. In the 90s, he started producing and directing. His first feature, Reality Bites, was moderately successful, but it was actually Stiller's next directing gig that nearly killed his career entirely. While it's since become a bit of a cult classic, The Cable Guy was a huge critical flop. Fortunately for Stiller, you can't keep a good Nepo baby down, and after a few years in director jail, he got another chance in 2001 with Zoolander. And it was a modest success. It made $61 million on a budget of $28 million. More importantly though, it received positive reviews and did very well on the home video market. And now's a good time to quickly mention just how important home video was in this era. Go watch the Matt Damon Hot Ones interview if you want a good overview, but essentially, most of the movies I'm going to talk about made a huge percentage of their money from home video rentals and sales, as well as cable syndication. So while I will be mentioning their box office performances, it is worth remembering that box office was just one part of the Frat Pack's success. If there's any Gen Alphas out there watching, go find your dad's dusty old DVD collection, and I'd be willing to bet you there is at least one copy of Anchorman or The 40-Year-Old Virgin in there. But let's get back to Zoolander. What does a moderately successful parody of the New York fashion industry have to do with the Frat Pack? After all, it doesn't really adhere to most of the rules I just mentioned earlier. And that's true. Zoolander isn't technically a Frat Pack movie. But, importantly, it set the stage for the rise of the Frat Pack in two ways. It gave Ben Stiller cachet to do more directing and acting, and just as importantly, it made a star of Will Ferrell.
Todd! Are you not aware that I get farty and bloated with a foamy latte?
Will Ferrell's eventual stardom was practically preordained. He was easily SNL's biggest star since Chris Farley, and he had already appeared in several Lorne Michaels-produced films like A Night at the Roxbury, Superstar, and The Ladies' Man. Ferrell also had made memorable supporting turns in Austin Powers and Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, but his scene-stealing turn as Mugatu, a megalomaniacal fashion mogul, finally elevated him into a household name. 2 years later, he'd steal the show again in Old School. And that brings us to the second seed of our family tree, Todd Phillips. Today, Phillips is mostly known for the Joker movies, but he's been around, and he's been pretty successful since the 90s. In 2000, Phillips directed Road Trip. Road Trip is a college sex comedy about a road trip to stop a VHS sex tape from being delivered to the lead's girlfriend. It was a different time. The film stars Breckin Meyer, Seann William Scott, and Tom Green. And the reason it doesn't really fit into the Frat Pack oeuvre is that it relies heavily on the audience's familiarity with 90s icons Stifler and Tom Green. Road Trip was more of a farewell to the raunchy American Pie-style teen comedy era than it was a welcoming of the Frat Pack era. But, just like Zoolander, it paved the way for a big player in the Frat Pack universe. Road Trip was also a modest success, making about $68 million on a $15 million budget. And it gave Phillips enough clout to make Old School. And that brings us to the first true Frat Pack movie. Released in 2003, Old School is a film about a bunch of 30-somethings opening a frat on a college campus. It made a respectable $87 million, but once again, it really took off on home video. Personally speaking, I was a senior in high school when Old School came out, and by the time I entered freshman year of college, everyone was yelling, "You're my boy, Blue!" at every frat party on campus. Old School also reintroduced the world to Vince Vaughn as a comedic actor. Vaughn got his big break in 1994's Swingers, playing basically a younger version of his character in Old School. But after a promising start in comedy, Vaughn veered into dramatic roles, which didn't go great for him. Vaughn's turn in Old School set the Frat Pack leading man template, a schlubby but charming everyman learning to grow up and improve himself. 2003 started the Frat Pack in earnest, but 2004 is when it took over American culture. In March 2004, Todd Phillips' follow-up to Old School, a remake of the 70s TV series Starsky and Hutch, starring Ben Stiller, Owen Wilson, and Vince Vaughn, grossed $170 million. It was the first of the Frat Pack films to make more than $100 million. Several months later, Vince Vaughn and Ben Stiller returned in Dodgeball, a true underdog story. Dodgeball grossed $168 million, almost identical to Starsky and Hutch, cementing both Vaughn and Stiller's star power. But 2004 wasn't done yet. Less than a month after Dodgeball, in July, we got Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy. Finally, after stealing scenes in other Frat Pack movies, Will Ferrell had his own star vehicle. And now it's time to talk about the third and final seed of the Frat Pack family tree, and it's not actually Will Ferrell. Judd Apatow got his start as a producer in the early 90s, and he was always just on the cusp of success, but it continued to elude him throughout the decade. He worked with a lot of big stars, but never on their biggest projects. A Jim Carrey stand-up special, a Roseanne Barr stand-up special, a Tom Arnold special. He worked on Jim Brooks' follow-up to The Simpsons, the cult favorite but short-lived, low-rated The Critic. He worked with Ben Stiller on his cult favorite, low-rated, short-lived sketch show, and he was a producer on The Cable Guy, which I already mentioned. Finally, Apatow got his own show, Freaks and Geeks. It was yet another critically beloved, short-lived cult classic. But he was given another shot, Undeclared. It was, critically praised, short-lived cult classic. Apatow just couldn't catch a break. And then finally, in 2004, he produced Anchorman. And from there, he never really looked back. He went on an absolute hot streak over the next few years, directing The 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up, while also producing Talladega Nights and Superbad. Anchorman didn't gross nearly as much as Dodgeball or Starsky and Hutch, making about $91 million at the box office. So while Will Ferrell was undeniably a star by now, the Frat Pack still very much belonged to Vince Vaughn, Ben Stiller, and Todd Phillips. This frat axis of power was short-lived though. In 2005 and 2006, Ben Stiller returned to more family-friendly hits with his Meet the Parents follow-up and the launch of his Night at the Museum franchise, as well as voice acting in the Madagascar animated movies. Phillips also struggled to follow up on his Frat Pack success, as School for Scoundrels, starring Billy Bob Thornton and Napoleon Dynamite's John Heder, only grossed $24 million. Don't worry though, we'll be hearing a lot from both of those guys later on. So, as Stiller and Phillips receded from the pack, this meant the future belonged to Will Ferrell, right? Perhaps, but not right away. Ferrell spent 2005 starring in Kicking and Screaming, Bewitched, Winter Passing, and The Producers. Of these, only Bewitched could be considered a true hit, making $131 million. So, while Ferrell spent 2005 experimenting with different genres, often with little financial success, Vince Vaughn had not only his biggest hit, but the biggest hit of the Frat Pack era thus far, Wedding Crashers. Co-starring Owen Wilson, Wedding Crashers raked in $288 million. It wasn't just a hit by Frat Pack standards, it was one of the biggest movies of the entire year. Luckily for Will Ferrell, he once again stole the show in an extended cameo at the end of the film.
Jazz? What the f do you want?
As if to remind audiences that while he might be trying out other genres, he was still one of the kings. 2005 also saw the surprise hit of The 40-Year-Old Virgin, which grossed a respectable $177 million. And it announced the arrival of Steve Carell as a leading man. Carell had risen to fame as a correspondent on The Daily Show before moving into films, where he, like Ferrell, stole the spotlight in movies like Bruce Almighty and Anchorman.
And 38 degrees in the Middle East.
40-Year-Old Virgin was his first big lead, and suddenly it seemed as though the pack had yet another king. However, Carell's reign was short-lived. The Office would premiere fall of 2005 on NBC. But it wasn't just Carell who benefited from the success of The 40-Year-Old Virgin. It also raised the profile of Seth Rogen, who I'll get to in a bit. Will Ferrell officially returned to the pack in 2006 with Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby. This would mark the box office zenith of Ferrell's Frat Pack films, and it would mark the first appearance of co-star John C. Reilly. Prior to Talladega Nights, Reilly was a dramatic character actor known for his work in prestige films like Boogie Nights, Chicago, and The Aviator. He wasn't really known for doing comedy, but almost immediately Reilly became a core member of the Frat Pack, and, in my opinion, the best member. Talladega Nights would also co-star Sacha Baron Cohen, who later that fall would release Borat. Now, Borat doesn't really fit into the Frat Pack oeuvre, but boy oh boy did it play to the same core audience. Personally speaking, I was in college, and my roommates and I did a few before going to the theater. All I really remember is laughing so hard at the nude fight scene that I legitimately worried I was going to pass out. 2007 saw Vince Vaughn and Will Ferrell sitting at the top of the Frat Pack. But then, Vince Vaughn just kind of stopped. He didn't stop making movies, but after a genuinely impressive run in Old School, Anchorman, Starsky and Hutch, Dodgeball, and Wedding Crashers, he changed gears almost entirely, leaning into Christmas movies, romantic comedies, and prestige films. Some of these movies were hits, but his strategy led to rapidly declining returns. Vaughn would try to dip back into frat-like comedies, but he would never again find Wedding Crashers' levels of success. Seth Rogen got his start on Judd Apatow's Freaks and Geeks. In his early years, Rogen looked kind of like a bully, sort of had a Buzz McAllister vibe, and so Hollywood didn't quite know what to do with him yet. He stayed in the Apatow world with Undeclared, and also had small roles in movies like Donnie Darko and Anchorman. It wasn't until The 40-Year-Old Virgin that Rogen finally found his niche and got a break. A few years after that, Rogen got called up to the big leagues for his first leading role in Knocked Up, which grossed a pretty astounding $220 million. The vacuum left by Steve Carell going to the office and Vince Vaughn doing Fred Claus opened the door for 2007 to become the year of Seth, with the 1-2 punch of Knocked Up and Superbad. Although Rogen only had a supporting role in Superbad, the script was co-written by him and Seth Goldberg, and the film, starring relative unknowns Jonah Hill and Michael Cera, grossed $171 million. The balance of power in the pack had now firmly shifted away from Vince Vaughn, Ben Stiller, and Todd Phillips to Judd Apatow, Seth Rogen, and Will Ferrell. 2007 also saw what is, in my opinion, the best movie of the Frat Pack era, Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story.
You're gonna have to give him a moment, son. Dewey Cox needs to think about his entire life before he plays.
A brilliant satire of prestige biopics, the film cemented John C. Reilly's comedic and musical skills.
Mama, you made it!
There's my favorite 14-year-old son.
Unfortunately, Walk Hard was a rare flop for the Frat Pack, grossing only $21 million. John C. Reilly, it seems, could work as part of a duo, but couldn't headline a film. And he rarely has since, which is a real shame, because he rules. If you haven't seen Walk Hard, please go do that now.
Dewey! Me! I'm halved!
Will Ferrell had another decent hit in 2007 with Blades of Glory, co-starring John Heder. But it didn't have quite the same cultural impact of his earlier work like Talladega Nights, and his reign once again started to look a little shaky. It got even shakier with the disappointing release of Semi-Pro, another sports comedy. It made only $44 million. But then, after a somewhat disappointing 2007 for both Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly, they reunited with a big hit in Step Brothers in 2008. By 2008, the Frat Pack diaspora had ballooned. Forgetting Sarah Marshall announced Jason Segel as the next schlubby, relatable protagonist. Pineapple Express continued Seth Rogen's dominance. Meanwhile, Ben Stiller made his triumphant return, directing Tropic Thunder. Tropic Thunder was easily the most ambitious film of the Frat Pack era, and alongside Walk Hard, it's the most stylistically interesting. It also made some choices that have aged not amazingly. The controversies around Tropic Thunder have been discussed ad nauseum and really should be their own video, so I'm just gonna move on. 2008 was also the first year to prominently feature Frat Pack mimics. Role models from comedy legend David Wayne starred Paul Rudd and Seann William Scott. It did a respectable, if unremarkable, $93 million. I feel kind of bad calling this movie a mimic because David Wayne had been around for years and he's responsible for Wet Hot American Summer, one of the all-time greatest comedies, along with a ton of A-plus sketch comedies. But I do suspect Role Models got the green light because it included Frat Pack mainstay Paul Rudd. It's also a really good movie if you've never seen it. I highly recommend it. Zack and Miri Make a Porno was Clerks auteur Kevin Smith's foray into the Frat Pack periphery. The movie has its moments, and it isn't terrible by any means, but it also struggles with an identity crisis. Is it a Kevin Smith movie or a Frat Pack movie? Audiences responded coldly, with the film only grossing $43 million. Looking back at the insane output of the Frat Pack from 2004 to 2008, it's not really that surprising to see the pack enter a bit of a fallow period starting in 2009. What is surprising is the huge dip in box office returns. Other than Walk Hard and Semi-Pro, basically every Frat Pack movie up to that point was grossing at least $100 million or more. But in 2009, every movie released by the Frat Pack diaspora failed to clear $100 million. This included Funny People, I Love You Man, Observe and Report, Land of the Lost, and Year One. Not all of them were outright flops. I Love You Man was pretty close to Role Models in terms of box office returns, but overall, 2009 was a lackluster year for the boys. Except for one. It's time to talk about The Hangover. I need to fess up to something. I loved The Hangover. I saw it in the theater twice and I laughed my ass off. But I would like to defend myself by pointing out that I was mostly excited to see other people finally embrace Zach Galifianakis. Prior to The Hangover, Galifianakis was a relatively obscure comedian and performer. My friends and I had rewatched his stand-up specials live at the Purple Onion and Comedians of Comedy, as well as his one-offs like the Absolute Vodka ads he did with Tim and Eric, his short-lived VH1 talk show, the weird indie films he did like Visioneers, even the Kanye West music video he was in with Will Oldham. That's a real thing, by the way. You can YouTube that. So I was genuinely happy for him to finally get a larger audience. And it is hard to understate how big of a hit The Hangover was. It made $469 million. That's nearly double Wedding Crashers, which had been the biggest hit up to this point. It was the 10th biggest movie of the entire year, and just for context, 2009 had a Twilight movie, Up, a Transformers sequel, a Harry Potter movie, and Avatar. The balance of power in the Frat Pack had shifted back. 2010 saw some modest successes, with Get Him to the Greek finally giving Jonah Hill his first leading role since Superbad. Will Ferrell recovered from Land of the Lost with The Other Guys, which did a robust $170 million. But after the tectonic shift of The Hangover, the Frat Pack was now firmly back in the hands of Todd Phillips. And in a way, after the drift towards Seth Rogen's stoner-friendly comedies and Will Ferrell's generally goofy comedies, The Hangover was much closer in spirit to the original Frat Pack films like Old School and Dodgeball. On the back of its wild success, Phillips and company rushed a sequel, The Hangover Part 2, which came out in 2011 and made $586 million, even more than the first. 2011 made it abundantly clear that the salad days of the Frat Pack were over. Vince Vaughn tried to return to the pack with The Dilemma, while Judd Apatow tried his hand at more serious fare with This Is 40. Both films underperformed, while the rest of the pack chose to sit the year out and work on decidedly unfratty films and other projects. It wasn't all doom and gloom, though. Besides the Hangover sequel, 2011 also saw the surprise success of Bridesmaids, which made $288 million. It was a huge hit thanks to the comedic chops of Kristen Wiig, Maya Rudolph, Rose Byrne, and Melissa McCarthy. And it also showed a pretty obvious next step for the Frat Pack blueprint, the sorority pack. As you'll no doubt have noticed, Frat Pack movies weren't exactly diverse. Women in particular were relegated to three basic archetypes: the virginal Madonna to pine after, the wacky slut, or the humorless scold. Interestingly, I'd say Anchorman probably did the best of all of them. The film gave Christina Applegate a big comedic role. She went toe-to-toe with Will Ferrell as Ron Burgundy's love interest and antagonist. She even gets a competing voiceover and a ton of screen time. Unfortunately, Hollywood didn't really seem to absorb the message of Bridesmaids, and it never even got a sequel. So that's about it, right? The Frat Pack just kind of peters out after 2011 because everyone involved gets bored or moves on to other projects. Maybe they kind of grow up and learn to become adults. Not exactly. 2012 through 2014 saw the Frat Pack renewed with energy and creativity. 21 Jump Street surprised everyone by making $202 million in 2012. It cemented Jonah Hill as a leading man and turned Channing Tatum into a new comedy star, welcoming him to the pack. A couple years later, the sequel would do even better, making $331 million. Meanwhile, Anchorman 2 grossed approximately the same as the first film, and This Is the End, which starred pretty much everyone in Seth Rogen's entourage, did a respectable $126 million. In 2014, Seth Rogen had another smash hit with Neighbors, which made $271 million. Rumors of the Frat Pack's demise were greatly exaggerated. In fact, the future seemed brighter than ever. So what happened? Well, the same thing that happened to all mid-budget movies. By 2014, Blockbuster had shrunk from 9,000 stores worldwide to less than 51 remaining in the United States. DVD sales had been falling steadily since their peak in 2008. Netflix's streaming service was increasingly dominant, and cable channels like Comedy Central, MTV, and TBS, which had for years syndicated the Frat Pack's movies, started experiencing rapid viewership declines. The Frat Pack had never been competitive with big-budget franchises, but it didn't really need to be. For example, the biggest movie of 2005 was Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, which made almost $900 million. The biggest Frat Pack movie of that year was Wedding Crashers, which made $288 million. However, Harry Potter cost about $150 million to make, whereas Wedding Crashers cost $40 million. In other words, Wedding Crashers, with a box office 7.1 times its budget, was actually more profitable than Harry Potter. Despite the math favoring mid-budget movies, Hollywood grew addicted to increasingly big box office numbers, especially as home video revenues shrank. And so it is that we enter 2016 and come full circle with the release of Zoolander 2. Zoolander 2 made $57 million, only slightly less than the first film. But this time, that was basically it. There was no second life for it in rentals, sales, and television. Instead, Zoolander 2 got plopped down on a streaming site and was largely forgotten. And that is the story of the Frat Pack, the last time comedy was king. So where are they now? These days he's producing a pretty wide variety of projects, most recently an Apple TV Plus series called Bad Monkey. After Ben Stiller's prestige attempt, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, failed to garner any real awards traction and Zoolander 2 disappointed at the box office, things were starting to seem pretty shaky. Fortunately for Ben, Apple TV Plus came calling and he has since found critical success producing Severance. Will Ferrell continues to produce a lot of projects and he still pops up in movies like Spirited, co-starring Ryan Reynolds, which premiered on Apple TV Plus. Wait, is Tim Cook like a Frat Pack guy? Ferrell has had less luck in leading roles, like the disastrous Holmes and Watson, which reteamed him with John C. Reilly. Instead, he seems to have circled back to his roots, popping up in supporting roles and cameos in projects like Barbie and The Boys. After the chilly reception to his more personal projects Funny People and This Is 40, Apatow had a modest success directing Trainwreck with Amy Schumer and Bill Hader. But in recent years, he's mostly moved away from directing narratives, focusing instead on documentaries and the occasional episode of television. Seth Rogen has had one of the most successful post-Frat Pack careers. He and his writing partner Seth Goldberg have become powerhouse producers, behind hits like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Preacher, Gen V, The Boys, and a ton of movies. Most recently, he just released a very good new series called The Studio, and it's on Apple TV Plus. Okay, Tim Cook is definitely a Frat Pack guy. Todd Phillips had his biggest hit yet in 2019 with Joker, and then he followed it up with the sequel, Joker Folie à Deux, which was also just a huge hit. Oh god, everyone loved it so much. John C. Reilly is still acting, including in former Frat Pack director Adam McKay's Winning Time on HBO. After leaving The Office, Steve Carell has had kind of mixed success as a dramatic actor with movies like Foxcatcher, The Big Short, Welcome to Marwen, and others. I've also never watched The Morning Show, but I hear it's fun in a soap opera kind of way. Carell also voices Gru in the Despicable Me franchise, so, he's doing fine. And so that's the story of the Frat Pack. With the death of mid-budget movies, most of these guys have become a lot more peripheral within pop culture. They're still in a lot of movies and TV, but it's a lot less common that people show up because they're in those movies and TV. So, is there any real hope? Well, in its current form, Hollywood seems unlikely to re-elevate comedy or comedians into the cultural juggernauts they once were. Instead, they seem destined to remain as niche players, appealing to small, devoted fan bases. One guy who is arguably ahead of the curve in that regard is someone I only briefly mentioned, Danny McBride. He was another peripheral Frat Pack player, showing up in movies like Tropic Thunder, Pineapple Express, and This Is the End. I think McBride, along with Rogen, provides the best possible blueprint for how to succeed in this current reality. McBride and his creative partner Jody Hill created Eastbound and Down during the Frat Pack era. It was a cult hit, but it never really broke through to mainstream audiences. However, his audience has remained remarkably consistent and loyal, following him and Hill from Eastbound to Vice Principals, and now The Righteous Gemstones. They've also had a big hand producing documentaries like Telemarketers, and are writing and producing horror franchises like Halloween and The Exorcist. Like Rogen, McBride has diversified. And I think that's probably the only way to survive these days. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that stuff. Comment with your favorite Frat Pack movie, least favorite Frat Pack movie, favorite actor. Also, I've got a new movie coming out, my first feature film, Sight Unseen. So keep an eye out for that. It is not a comedy, it's a horror film, so I should probably do one of these video essays about horror pretty soon. But anyway, thanks again, and I will see you soon.